Certain behaviors reveal character so completely that they require immediate response rather than patient deliberation. What transpired on the Family Feud stage in February 2025 would become a defining moment not merely for the participants involved, but for Steve Harvey himself, who made a decision that prioritized human dignity over television entertainment in a manner that demonstrated profound leadership and moral clarity. Throughout his extensive career hosting Family Feud, Steve had witnessed various family dynamics, occasional tensions, and moments of interpersonal conflict. However, nothing in his experience prepared him for what would unfold when a contestant's treatment of his spouse crossed boundaries of basic human decency in such an egregious manner that continuing the game became impossible. The incident serves as a powerful reminder that there exist standards of behavior below which dissent cannot be tolerated regardless of context or circumstance, and that standing up for those being mistreated sometimes requires immediate action, even when such action disrupts established procedures and expectations. On this particular afternoon, one man's verbal abuse of his wife would collide with Steve Harvey's commitment to treating all people with dignity and respect, resulting in an unprecedented decision that would send a clear message about acceptable conduct and the consequences of crossing fundamental lines of decency. Before examining this extraordinary sequence of events that illustrates the importance of defending those who cannot defend themselves and the courage required to interrupt harmful behavior, even when doing so creates significant complications, please take a moment to support our channel by selecting the like option and subscribing to ensure you receive these significant Family Feud moments that provide valuable lessons about respect, dignity, and the responsibility to intervene when witnessing unacceptable treatment of others. The Chambers family from Detroit, Michigan entered the Family Feud stage with energy that immediately registered as problematic to experienced observers. Leading the group was Gregory Chambers, a 44-year-old automotive parts manager whose aggressive demeanor and dismissive attitude toward his family members suggested concerning interpersonal dynamics. Beside him stood his wife of 16 years, Susan Chambers, a quiet woman whose body language communicated resignation and diminished self-worth in ways that troubled production staff who interacted with the family during pre-show preparation. Their family team included Gregory's brother Nathan, Susan's sister Michelle, and their adult son Daniel, creating a composition that would bear witness to behavior that became increasingly unacceptable as the taping progressed. Steve Harvey welcomed the Chambers family with his characteristic warmth, though his experienced eye immediately detected tension within the group that extended beyond normal nervous energy about television appearance. During the pre-game conversation, Gregory dominated completely, speaking over Susan when she attempted to respond to Steve's questions and making disparaging comments about her intelligence and capabilities with a casual cruelty that suggested this represented his normal communication pattern rather than unusual behavior prompted by competitive stress. Steve attempted to redirect the interaction to give Susan opportunities to speak, but Gregory consistently interrupted and dismissed her contributions. The game commenced with standard format and competitive energy. The Chambers family faced the Thompson family from Atlanta, and the early rounds demonstrated Gregory's aggressive approach to team leadership. However, what became increasingly apparent was that Gregory's competitive drive manifested not as strategic thinking or supportive coordination, but rather as contempt and verbal abuse directed primarily at Susan. When she provided answers that did not appear on the survey board, Gregory berated her publicly. When she hesitated before responding, he criticized her intelligence. When she successfully provided correct answers, he minimized her contributions and redirected credit to himself or other team members. The pattern of behavior was consistent, deliberate, and cruel. During the second round of the main game, Susan was called to the buzzer for a face-off question. She appeared nervous but ready to participate. The question asked contestants to name something people do to relax after a stressful day. Susan thought briefly before answering, "Take a bath," a reasonable and logical response. However, before Steve could reveal whether the answer appeared on the board, Gregory interjected loudly from his position with the family team, stating that the answer was stupid and that Susan never had any good ideas. The comment was delivered with obvious contempt and was clearly audible throughout the studio. The audience reacted with uncomfortable silence, and Steve Harvey's expression shifted from his normal warmth to something considerably more serious. Understanding the full significance of what would transpire requires comprehensive knowledge of the Chambers marriage and the pattern of verbal and emotional abuse that had characterized Gregory's treatment of Susan throughout their 16-year relationship. Gregory and Susan had met 18 years earlier when both worked at an automotive manufacturing facility in Detroit. Gregory was employed as a supervisor on the production line, a position that provided authority over other workers and reinforced his tendency toward controlling behavior. Susan worked in quality control, a detail-oriented position that required careful attention and systematic thinking, but that Gregory characterized as menial and unchallenging. Their courtship had been brief and characterized by Gregory's dominant personality overwhelming Susan's more reserved nature. Early warning signs of Gregory's tendency toward verbal aggression and dismissiveness had been present, but minimized by Susan, who convinced herself that his critical comments represented high standards rather than disrespect. Friends and family members had expressed concerns about the relationship dynamic, noting that Gregory seemed to derive satisfaction from making Susan feel inadequate, and that his public treatment of her involved consistent undermining and criticism disguised as humor or honesty. The marriage that followed had been characterized by escalating verbal and emotional abuse. Gregory criticized every aspect of Susan's appearance, intelligence, domestic capabilities, and contributions to their household. He made disparaging comments about her in front of their son Daniel, teaching him by example that women deserved contempt rather than respect. He controlled their finances completely, providing Susan with minimal access to money while spending freely on himself and his interests. He isolated Susan from friends and activities, claiming that she was too stupid to have interesting conversations or too incompetent to participate in social engagements without embarrassing him. Over 16 years, this pattern of abuse had systematically destroyed Susan's self-esteem and confidence. She had internalized Gregory's criticisms to the point where she questioned her own perceptions and capabilities. She had become increasingly isolated and dependent, unable to envision a path forward that did not include Gregory despite the constant emotional harm he inflicted. She had learned to minimize her presence in social situations to avoid triggering Gregory's public criticism, and she had developed coping mechanisms that involved accepting his verbal abuse as inevitable rather than as something that could or should be challenged. The Family Feud appearance had been Gregory's idea, conceived as an opportunity to demonstrate his superiority and intelligence on a public platform. He had assembled a family team that he believed would perform well under his leadership, and he had made clear to Susan that he expected her to participate minimally to avoid embarrassing him with incorrect answers. Susan had agreed to the appearance out of habit of compliance rather than genuine enthusiasm, recognizing that refusing would trigger conflict and criticism that would be more unpleasant than enduring the game show experience. What Gregory failed to recognize was that his treatment of Susan, which he had normalized within their private relationship and immediate family circle, would be perceived very differently by external observers who had not been gradually acclimated to his abusive patterns. He expected that other people would accept his characterization of Susan as incompetent and would view his criticism as reasonable feedback rather than as abusive behavior. He had no awareness that the concentrated public display of contempt and verbal aggression on the Family Feud stage would cross thresholds of acceptable conduct in ways that would trigger intervention rather than passive observation. Steve Harvey, meanwhile, had established clear personal and professional standards regarding treatment of contestants on his show. Throughout his career across multiple platforms, he had been consistent in his commitment to dignity, respect, and basic human decency. He had intervened in various situations when he perceived that someone was being mistreated or disrespected, and he had made clear through both statements and actions that he would not be complicit in behavior that violated fundamental principles of how people should treat each other. The collision between Gregory's normalized abuse and Steve's commitment to dignity would create circumstances that would result in unprecedented action. The game continued after Gregory's initial disparaging comment about Susan's answer, though the atmosphere had shifted perceptibly. Steve had paused before revealing whether "take a bath" appeared on the survey board, making brief eye contact with Susan in a manner that communicated support and recognition before turning to show that her answer was indeed on the board as the number 4 response. The studio audience applauded the correct answer with an enthusiasm that seemed to carry additional meaning, as though people were specifically celebrating Susan's success in defiance of Gregory's dismissive prediction. However, Gregory showed no acknowledgement of being wrong about Susan's answer quality and instead immediately redirected focus to strategy for the next response. As subsequent rounds progressed, Gregory's treatment of Susan became increasingly aggressive and public. When control of the board passed to the Chambers family and Susan was next in line to provide an answer, Gregory attempted to skip her turn and direct another team member to answer instead, stating explicitly that Susan would probably provide a wrong answer and cost them points. Harvey intervened directly, stating that the game format required each family member to participate in turn and that Susan deserved the opportunity to answer. The intervention was delivered with firm authority that made clear Steve's disapproval of Gregory's attempt to exclude Susan. Susan provided her answer to the question, which asked contestants to name something people check multiple times before leaving the house. She responded, "Making sure the doors are locked," a logical and common answer. However, before Steve could reveal the board, Gregory interjected again with criticism, stating that Susan's answer was too obvious and that she never thought creatively. The second public criticism, in quick succession, created visible discomfort among the other family members, with Susan's sister Michelle looking increasingly distressed and the adult son Daniel appearing embarrassed by his father's behavior. Harvey addressed Gregory directly, stating that the constant criticism of Susan was inappropriate and disrespectful. He explained that Family Feud was meant to be a positive experience for families, that all team members deserved encouragement and support, and that Gregory's treatment of his wife was creating an uncomfortable environment for everyone present. He suggested that Gregory focus on his own answers and allow other family members to contribute without commentary or criticism. The admonition was delivered with Steve's characteristic directness, but also with an edge that communicated genuine disapproval rather than gentle correction. Gregory responded defensively, suggesting that Steve did not understand their relationship dynamic and that Susan expected and accepted honest feedback about her limitations. He stated that he was simply being realistic about Susan's capabilities and that pretending she was more intelligent or competent than she actually was would not help their team win the game. The response demonstrated such profound lack of awareness about appropriate behavior and such explicit contempt for Susan that the studio audience reacted with audible disapproval. Several people could be heard expressing shock at Gregory's characterization of his wife, and the atmosphere in the studio had shifted from entertainment to tension. Steve made the decision to take a commercial break earlier than scheduled, recognizing that the situation required intervention beyond what could be managed during active gameplay. During the break, he consulted with producers about options for addressing Gregory's behavior. He also spoke privately with Susan, asking whether she was comfortable continuing and whether the treatment she was experiencing from Gregory represented his normal behavior or unusual stress-related conduct. Susan's response confirmed that Gregory's public criticism represented his standard communication pattern rather than anomalous behavior, and that she had learned over 16 years to accept this treatment as normal despite recognizing on some level that it was harmful and wrong. When the cameras resumed rolling after the commercial break, Steve addressed the situation with the entire studio audience and viewing public. He stated that he had been hosting Family Feud for many years and had witnessed various family dynamics, but that he had never before encountered a situation where one family member consistently and deliberately demeaned another family member with such obvious contempt and disrespect. He explained that while competition could create stress and tension, there was no excuse for verbal abuse, and that allowing such behavior to continue on his show would communicate acceptance of treatment that violated basic human dignity. Steve turned to address Gregory directly, stating that his treatment of Susan was unacceptable and that it needed to stop immediately if the family wished to continue competing. He made clear that this was not a suggestion or gentle guidance, but rather a firm requirement for continuing participation in the game. Gregory responded with visible irritation, suggesting that Steve was overreacting and that his comments about Susan were not abuse, but rather honest assessment. He stated that Susan understood that he had high standards and that she appreciated his feedback even when it was critical. It was at this moment that Gregory made a comment that would prove to be the final transgression that ended his participation in Family Feud. He stated dismissively that Susan was useless at pretty much everything, and that expecting her to contribute meaningfully to their team's strategy was unrealistic. The comment was delivered with casual cruelty, as though describing an objective fact rather than expressing profound disrespect for another human being. The studio audience reacted with immediate and loud disapproval, many people shouting objections and expressing shock at the explicit nature of the insult. Steve Harvey's response to Gregory's comment was immediate and unequivocal. He stated clearly that Gregory's participation in the game was over, that he would need to leave the stage immediately, and that his behavior had crossed lines that made his continued presence incompatible with the values and standards of Family Feud. He explained that while the show welcomed competition and even welcomed spirited family dynamics, it would not provide a platform for verbal abuse and would not be complicit in treatment of another human being that violated basic dignity and respect. He made clear that this decision was final and not subject to negotiation or reconsideration. Gregory's initial reaction combined shock with indignation. He appeared genuinely surprised that his treatment of Susan had triggered such definitive response, suggesting the depth of his normalization of abusive behavior and his lack of awareness about how external observers would perceive his conduct. He attempted to argue that Steve was overreacting, that his comments about Susan were not meant to be hurtful, and that he was simply being honest about her limitations. He suggested that political correctness and excessive sensitivity were preventing honest communication, framing his verbal abuse as truth, telling that others were too weak to accept. Steve's response dismantled Gregory's attempted justifications with precision and moral clarity. He stated that honesty did not require cruelty, that truthful communication did not necessitate contempt, and that Gregory's characterization of abuse as honest feedback represented rationalization rather than legitimate explanation. He explained that the way Gregory spoke to and about Susan revealed profound disrespect and suggested a pattern of verbal abuse that extended far beyond the Family Feud stage. He stated that providing a platform for such behavior would make the show complicit in emotional abuse, and that he would not allow that to occur under any circumstances. The confrontation between Steve and Gregory held the studio in absolute attention. Production staff had approached the stage prepared to escort Gregory out if he refused to leave voluntarily, but Steve's moral authority and the clear support of the studio audience made physical intervention unnecessary. Gregory recognized that he had no allies in the studio, that his behavior had been so egregious that even his own family team members were not defending him, and that continued argument would only further humiliate him in front of hundreds of witnesses and television cameras. Before Gregory left the stage, Steve made a point of addressing Susan directly. He stated that no person deserved to be spoken to or about in the manner that Gregory had demonstrated, that Susan's worth as a human being was not defined by her husband's contemptuous assessments, and that the treatment she had experienced on the Family Feud stage likely represented only a fraction of what she endured in private. He encouraged her to recognize that Gregory's behavior reflected his character deficiencies rather than her inadequacies, and he urged her to seek support and resources for addressing what appeared to be a seriously abusive relationship. Susan's response to Steve's intervention and support was characterized by visible emotional conflict. Years of abuse had conditioned her to minimize Gregory's behavior and to accept his characterization of her as accurate. Yet the public validation from Steve and the obvious support from the studio audience created cognitive dissonance with her internalized beliefs about deserving contempt. She appeared simultaneously grateful for the intervention and uncertain about how to process the recognition that external observers viewed Gregory's treatment of her as unacceptable abuse, rather than as reasonable feedback about her limitations. Gregory left the stage with obvious anger and humiliation, escorted by production staff who ensured his departure was managed professionally despite the unusual circumstances. His exit was met with applause from the studio audience, not as celebration of his humiliation, but rather as endorsement of Steve's decision to prioritize dignity and respect over entertainment value and continuation of the game format. The remaining Chambers family members stood on stage in various states of shock, uncertainty about how the game would proceed, and apparent relief that Gregory's abusive behavior had been interrupted rather than allowed to continue unchallenged. Steve addressed the situation with the remaining family members and the studio audience, explaining that the Chambers family would be allowed to continue competing with a substitute player from the family alternates who had attended the taping. However, he made clear that the decision to remove Gregory was not merely about completing the game, but rather about establishing and maintaining standards regarding acceptable treatment of people on his show. He stated that the incident would serve as a clear message that verbal abuse would not be tolerated regardless of context or relationship dynamics, and that defending the dignity of those being mistreated took precedence over entertainment or procedural continuity. The immediate aftermath of Gregory's removal from the Family Feud stage created ripples that extended far beyond the game show context. The episode, when it eventually aired with careful editing to preserve the essential truth while managing the sensitive nature of the verbal abuse, became one of the most discussed and analyzed Family Feud broadcasts in the show's extensive history. The incident sparked intensive national conversation about verbal and emotional abuse in marriage, the normalization of contemptuous treatment in long-term relationships, and the responsibility of bystanders to intervene when witnessing unacceptable behavior rather than remaining passive observers. Steve Harvey addressed the incident extensively across his various media platforms, using it as a teaching moment about recognizing abuse, supporting victims, and understanding that intervention sometimes requires immediate action even when such action creates complications or disrupts established procedures. He explained that his decision to remove Gregory from the game had not been made lightly or impulsively, but rather represented recognition that allowing the verbal abuse to continue would communicate acceptance of behavior that violated fundamental principles of human dignity. He emphasized that standing up for those being mistreated sometimes required courage to act decisively even when the consequences were uncertain. Susan Chambers faced the difficult task of processing what had occurred and determining how to move forward in her relationship with Gregory. The public nature of the intervention created immediate crisis in her marriage, as Gregory was furious about being removed from Family Feud and blamed Susan for his humiliation rather than accepting responsibility for his own behavior. However, the incident also provided Susan with external validation that Gregory's treatment of her constituted abuse rather than reasonable feedback, creating cognitive dissonance with her internalized beliefs that she deserved contempt. She consulted with domestic violence resources that production staff had provided, beginning a long process of recognizing the abuse she had endured and considering options for addressing her situation. Gregory experienced immediate and severe social consequences for his public behavior on Family Feud. Colleagues and acquaintances who viewed the episode or heard about the incident expressed shock at his treatment of Susan and distanced themselves from someone whose character had been so clearly revealed to involve habitual verbal abuse and contempt for his spouse. His employer received complaints from employees who were disturbed by Gregory's behavior and questioned whether someone who treated his wife with such obvious disrespect could be trusted to treat subordinates or colleagues appropriately. While his employment was not terminated based solely on the Family Feud incident, he was removed from supervisory responsibilities pending review of his professional conduct and workplace relationships. The adult son Daniel faced complicated emotions regarding his father's removal from Family Feud, and the public exposure of family dynamics that he had witnessed throughout his childhood but had normalized as typical marital interaction. Watching external observers react with horror to treatment that he had considered normal created recognition that his father's behavior toward his mother had been abusive rather than merely strict or demanding. He began his own therapy process to address the impact of growing up in a household characterized by verbal abuse, and to examine how witnessing his father's contemptuous treatment of his mother had affected his own developing attitudes toward women and relationships. 6 months following the Family Feud incident, Susan had made the decision to separate from Gregory and pursue divorce. The process had not been linear or simple, as years of conditioning and financial dependence created significant barriers to leaving the relationship. However, the public intervention by Steve Harvey and the subsequent support from domestic violence organizations had provided Susan with resources and validation that enabled her to begin recognizing that she deserved better treatment and that Gregory's behavior would not change despite his promises and his blaming of external factors for his abusive conduct. The divorce proceedings were contentious, with Gregory attempting to minimize his behavior and portraying Susan as oversensitive and vindictive, but the Family Feud footage provided clear documentation of his character and his pattern of verbal abuse. Steve Harvey maintained periodic contact with Susan through the production team, offering encouragement and connecting her with additional resources as needed. He used his various platforms to discuss the incident as an example of how abusive behavior becomes normalized within relationships and how external intervention can sometimes provide victims with the validation and support necessary to recognize that their situation is neither normal nor acceptable. He emphasized that while his intervention on Family Feud had been important, the real work of recovery and rebuilding had to be undertaken by Susan herself with support from appropriate resources and trained professionals. 1 year after Gregory's removal from Family Feud, Susan had established a new life characterized by independence and recovery from years of verbal and emotional abuse. The divorce had been finalized with a settlement that provided appropriate financial support while severing the legal and financial ties that had helped maintain her dependence on Gregory. She had engaged in extensive therapy to address the psychological impact of sustained abuse and to rebuild self-esteem that had been systematically destroyed over 16 years of marriage. She had reconnected with friends and family members from whom Gregory had isolated her, and she had begun developing interests and activities that reflected her genuine preferences rather than Gregory's control. Susan became an advocate for victims of verbal and emotional abuse, speaking at support groups and conferences about the insidious nature of abuse that does not leave physical marks, but that destroys psychological well-being and autonomy just as thoroughly as physical violence. She emphasized the importance of external validation in helping victims recognize that treatment they have normalized actually constitutes abuse, and she credited Steve Harvey's intervention on Family Feud as the catalyst that enabled her to begin questioning Gregory's characterization of their relationship dynamic as normal and her characterization of herself as deserving contempt. 3 years following the Family Feud incident, Susan had rebuilt her life to an extent that would have seemed impossible during her marriage to Gregory. She had returned to school to complete a degree in social work, planning to use her experience to help other domestic violence survivors navigate the recovery process. She had developed healthy relationships based on mutual respect and equality rather than domination and control. She maintained relationship with her son Daniel, who had undertaken his own recovery process and had apologized to his mother for the years when he had participated in normalizing his father's abusive behavior rather than recognizing it as wrong and defending her. Gregory experienced lasting consequences for his behavior that extended well beyond the immediate humiliation of being removed from Family Feud. His social reputation never recovered from the association with verbal abuse that the incident had established. His professional advancement was permanently compromised by questions about his judgment and character. His relationship with his son remained strained by Daniel's growing recognition that his father's treatment of his mother had been abusive, and that Gregory's attempts to justify his behavior represented rationalization rather than legitimate explanation. Gregory engaged in anger management counseling as required by the divorce court, but his progress appeared limited and his fundamental inability to accept responsibility for his abusive behavior remained evident. 5 years after that remarkable moment when Steve Harvey made the unprecedented decision to remove a contestant from Family Feud for verbal abuse of his spouse, the incident remained a significant cultural reference point in discussions about emotional abuse and the responsibility of bystanders to intervene when witnessing mistreatment. Legal and social service professionals analyzed the case as an example of how public intervention can provide abuse victims with the external validation necessary to begin questioning normalized mistreatment and considering options for addressing their situations. Steve Harvey continued to reference the Chambers family incident for years as an illustration of the principle that standing up for basic human dignity sometimes requires immediate action, even when such action creates complications or disrupts established procedures. He used the situation to encourage his audiences to recognize signs of verbal and emotional abuse in their own relationships and in the relationships of people around them, and to understand that intervention on behalf of those being mistreated represented moral imperative rather than optional involvement in other people's private business. The relationship between Steve and Susan continued through periodic communication facilitated by the production team. He celebrated her progress in rebuilding her life and occasionally featured her on his programs to discuss her recovery and the resources available for people in abusive relationships. He maintained that his decision to remove Gregory from Family Feud represented one of the most important actions he had taken in his professional career, not because it generated publicity or acclaim, but because it communicated clear values about acceptable treatment of people and demonstrated that entertainment considerations would never take precedence over basic human dignity. 10 years after the Family Feud taping, when Gregory Chambers was removed from the stage for calling his wife useless, the incident continued to serve as a powerful example of the importance of intervening when witnessing abuse rather than remaining passive. Documentary filmmakers examined the case as part of broader explorations of emotional abuse and the various mechanisms through which sustained mistreatment becomes normalized within relationships. Academic researchers studying bystander intervention and social responsibility used Steve Harvey's decision as an illustration of effective intervention that prioritized victim support over procedural continuity or entertainment value. Susan had established a successful career in social work specializing in domestic violence intervention and recovery. She maintained her advocacy work while focusing primarily on direct service provision to abuse survivors. She spoke publicly about her experience when opportunities arose to help others, but she had moved beyond defining herself primarily through Gregory's abuse and had built an identity based on her professional contributions and personal growth. She credited Steve Harvey's intervention on Family Feud as the moment when external reality broke through years of conditioning and enabled her to begin questioning whether she deserved the treatment Gregory had normalized. The story of Gregory and Susan Chambers serves as a compelling testament to the importance of recognizing verbal and emotional abuse as serious violations deserving immediate response, the responsibility of those who witness mistreatment to intervene rather than remain passive, and the courage required to prioritize human dignity over convenience or procedural expectations. It demonstrates that standing up for those being mistreated sometimes requires immediate action that disrupts established plans and creates complications, but that such action represents moral imperative rather than optional involvement when basic standards of decent human treatment are being violated. The case provides important lessons about recognizing that abuse takes many forms beyond physical violence, that verbal and emotional abuse can destroy psychological well-being just as thoroughly as physical assault, and that intervention on behalf of victims can provide the external validation necessary for them to begin questioning normalized mistreatment and considering options for addressing their situations. It reminds us that entertainment and procedural continuity must never take precedence over basic human dignity, and that those with platforms and authority have particular responsibility to use their position to defend those who are being mistreated and to establish clear standards regarding acceptable conduct. If this account has provided valuable insight into the dynamics of verbal and emotional abuse, the importance of intervening when witnessing mistreatment rather than remaining passive, and the courage required to prioritize human dignity over entertainment or convenience, even when doing so creates significant complications, please take a moment to support our channel by selecting the like option and subscribing to ensure you receive additional family feud moments and compelling narratives that demonstrate moral leadership, the responsibility to defend those being mistreated, and the various ways that intervention can provide abuse victims with the validation and support necessary to begin recognizing that they deserve better treatment and that recovery from sustained abuse represents achievable reality rather than impossible aspiration.